go ahead and get started here. Just make sure I'm recording. So the song is from the Broadway musical Camelot. How many are familiar with the show, out of curiosity? Yeah, quite a few of us, right? I always enjoyed the music growing up. Back in my theater days, one of my favorite songs was Lancelot's song, C'est Moi. I like to sing that one. It was a lot of fun. I liked the movie with Richard Harris, but the movie doesn't actually have this particular song. In it, the show's villain, Sir Mordred, he's singing about why he does not care for the so-called knightly virtues, for the chivalric code, if you will. He's making the chivalry is dead argument. Over the next several weeks, as part of our Lenten ministry, we are going to respectfully disagree with Mordred as we explore the holy virtues of the Christian church. Specifically, we're going to use those that have been offered by Catholicism. There are 7 of them. We've got 6 weeks in Lent plus Easter Sunday. But we are going to try to apply some of our own language and our own theology to them. The ones we speak about are not going to be exactly the same as those listed in the song, but hey, we didn't hear the song, so we don't have to worry about that. They overlap pretty well with the ones we're talking about. We're going to be talking about purity, humility, diligence, charity, benevolence, patience, and temperance. And I believe the order will vary slightly. But you'll notice we have an appropriate wall hanging for the series as well. Some of our current terminology that we would use to update them is on there. Some of them line up with what's on there. In listing them, which we're going to have a chance to review a few times these next few weeks, one thing becomes very clear: that the language and terminology that the church has used for them is in need of an update. So part of the goal of this series will be to reevaluate these virtues and to bring them into the 21st century. So one way we're going to do that is to use our Wesleyan and Methodist language and theology. Another way will be to associate each of them with a holy ideal, such as love, hope, grace, faith, and so on. So this is going to prove to be very important, because during this discussion, we're going to discover that these 7 virtues are not motivators, but pacifiers. In other words, they are intended to prevent us from doing bad things, to stay our hand, while the 7 deadly sins, which we hear about a lot in pop culture, are the vices, the things that motivate us to do bad things or to take unholy action. A few weeks back, we talked about, regarding holy action and unholy action, we talked about the difference between thought and word, between word and action, remembering with some help from Harry Potter that our actions and choices are what define us. So, we have pacifiers and vices, but it leads us to ask the question: if we're concerned about doing bad things, if we're concerned about preventing bad things, then what are the things that motivate us to do good? What are the holy motivators? And that is where the ideals are going to come from: hope, faith, love, and so forth. So, in the end, I'm going to ask Tim to bring up a slide here. In the end, our series is going to look something like this. We've got 7 weeks, we've got 7 virtues. Correspondingly, we have 7 sins. And what we're going to do is we'll say, well, okay, the virtue prevents bad things for the most part. This isn't perfect. Not everything will fit perfectly. The vice enables the bad things, but what we want to know is what motivates the good things. So you see some question marks up on that other side. We have the holy ideals on the left. We're going to reveal those each week. In the middle, we have the virtues. On the other side, we have the vices. There is a possibility maybe of adding a 4th column here, which would include paralytics, or things that prevent us from doing good, which might include fear, pain, grief, and so on. So for now, this is the template we're working with. It's going to be more of a rule of thumb than an absolute law. Today's virtue, as you may all have noticed, is purity. So this is also referred to by the church in the past as chastity, but we are going to stick with purity because, again, we are trying to update these and make them more relatable. So the idea of chastity or of being chaste, it has had a specific connotation, and it does these days. It is almost exclusively associated with sexual abstinence, but it is not quite that simple. In fact, chastity, in its original context, it refers to acceptable or praiseworthy sexual conduct. It's not just about abstinence. It includes healthy sexual relationships within the confines of Christian marriage, marital fidelity, and so forth. So chastity and the idea of being chaste, they've had slightly different meanings in the past. They tend to refer to sexual statuses beyond just those of virginity or abstinence or the lack thereof. But again, times have changed. So we are not here today to talk about sexual purity or abstinence or to condemn premarital or extramarital affairs. And I'm also going to point out, while we're at it, I'll point out that we decided on our sermon topics before I agreed to have my parents visit this weekend. So it's only by coincidence that they're here on the chastity sex sermon day. But instead of talking about chastity, we are going to speak about its intended result, which is that of purity. So the words chaste and chastity, in fact, they originate from the Latin adjective castus, which literally means pure. And I think that purity needs to be talked about in a manner beyond the physical. Now, for a long time, the church has interpreted purity in this physical way, believing that abstaining from physical pleasure or lust or ecstasy was the truest way of being chaste. And it is part of, if I may, society's long-standing obsession with sexual behavior and specifically with controlling sexual behavior and the things we choose to do with our bodies, particularly women. So we have turned it into kind of a taboo subject. We are uncomfortable talking about it. We don't preach about it very often. And this is in part because of concerns about the sin, the concern about ecstasy or perhaps lust. So you'll notice here that we have offered joy and truth as the holy ideals that are reflections of purity or perhaps in which purity is realized. Ecstasy, on the other hand, would be the opposite of that, right? It would be an experience of joy that is devoid of truth, a kind of false purity or an escape, a shutting out of that which is real. And so because of this, it has become easy when discussing chastity and purity to focus on sexual pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure that operates outside of emotional or marital commitment, outside of faith, or even outside the function of procreation, which some theologians have argued is the only purpose of sex. This same dynamic, it can be applied in part to drug use and sobriety, to negative emotional catharsis such as anger or schadenfreude, and even to grief, which stands opposed to joy. The concern is that we get trapped in that which is destructive or false, rather than resisting it, or else processing it and moving forward into that which is good and true. Now, this is perhaps where our scripture readings can come in for today. We will start with our gospel reading this morning, which has a brief one in which we were told that after being baptized by John the Baptist, Christ went out into the wilderness for 40 days. And there was tempted by, my manuscript says tempted by Stan. That's not accurate. Tempted by Satan he was. It's no offense, Stan, where it's here, somewhere around here. In some versions of this passage, we are given specific details of exactly how Christ is tempted, while in others, such as this one, it says simply that he was tempted. It's not exactly clear what transpires in the wilderness with Jesus, but we are given to understand that he is tempted in turn by hunger, power, and wealth, all of which are real temptations that we deal with every day, although I would argue that power is probably the one we really view as a temptation, while hunger and wealth are generally viewed as necessities to be fulfilled. Nowhere in here is Christ tempted by ecstasy or by any specific means of false pleasure, such as physical pleasure or hallucinogens or anything like that? Perhaps his visions or perhaps power are meant to satisfy this area. But the means of temptation doesn't really matter. What matters is Christ's resistance to it. Christ remains pure, uncorrupted, unflappable, and we are all meant to follow this example. Our other reading today, and in a rare turn, a more significant one perhaps from the Old Testament, is the Genesis reading describing God's covenant with Noah. Following the great flood, God speaks with Noah and his family, saying, "I will establish a covenant with you, your descendants, and every living creature with you, that never again will I send another flood to destroy life on earth." God here is promising that even though humanity be sinful and imperfect, even though it be prone to impurity or falsehood, God will provide a means of forgiveness rather than a means of punishment. And as a symbol of this covenant, God provides through the clouds a rainbow, so that whenever we see this beautiful phenomenon, it might serve as a reminder to us and to God of that covenant of forgiveness. In our discussion about purity and about the things that we deem to be acceptable or appropriate for their preservation of that purity, we must remember that the ideals which are pure, which we offer up today as joy and truth, are of greater significance than our physical selves. This also means that while resisting temptation is important, the forgiveness of God, which purifies us and sanctifies us, will always be more so. For there is no amount of sin or unholy behavior that can ever outweigh the pureness of God's radical love and grace, or the truth of God's eternal being. This might just be the same conclusion that we reach next week when we are discussing humility and hubris. And it might be the same conclusion we reach every week that follows in this series. And that might just be the whole point of it. Thanks be to God, and amen.